On today's show, we're going to be talking about contributions and feedback in design systems. How do you deal with feedback for contributions? How do you foster quality? And what do you do if the component that has just been submitted is a giant poo emoji? I'm Luke Murphy, and I'm joined by my co host, Michelle Chin. We're both design advocates at zeroheight, the design system management platform, and this is Design Systems WTF. So, this is your topic, Michelle, isn't it?
Yeah, I
I feel like is this because you have horror stories? Is that
sometimes yeah, I always have horror stories. I'm very scarred up and emotionally traumatized from working in design systems. Which is why I'm a design advocate and not doing design systems right now. Um
See, this is why I just didn't have a contribution model at my last design systems play, like the place where I had a design system in place. Um, I just sat in my ivory tower and dictated what needed to be done and told them how to use the thing, which, now I look back and realize it was probably a terrible, terrible idea. But
I mean, to some extent, like, I think design systems do need some sort of art direction, creative direction, like visual, visionary direction, which makes sense, like, to have, like, one person, like, kind of guide that. But then when you have, like, a more federated system and people feel like everyone can weigh in, like, that's where it gets messy and there's, like, no direction. But that's, like, I feel like a different topic altogether.
I was
But
going to say, I definitely don't advocate for the ivory tower system. That is a terrible idea. So
yeah,
don't
I think there's,
please
like,
don't think that I do.
some balance, right? Like, I think there's
Yeah.
some balance. But I this does I've heard this has come up in, like, consulting sessions with customers where they're, like, trying to get their governance, like, set up, but then they're just like,
Yeah.
"What happens if, someone, like, really is, like, really trying to push their component," and you're just like, "This is, like, really bad UX." Like, nobody would do this interaction of, like, selecting a drop down and then having a mix of options between, like, radio buttons and check boxes and a, like, auto-populated search or something crazy, right? Like, something
Yeah.
that was, like, never before seen, and yet they're very insistent of, like, "This is a really important pattern, we don't have this pattern," that type of thing, and so they're just like, "How do I navigate that?"
Right.
Um
So when it comes to, because I think that, what we're talking about here as well is we're talking about governance, right? When it comes to our contribution models. And I don't know, I always saw this contribution model. I thought that it was this magical, I don't know, piece of tooling that you could have been put in place when I first heard about it. Um, and then as soon as I realized, oh, wait, we're just talking about some processes and like approval processes and, I don't know, documentation about like what's expected.
Yeah.
um, I mean, it doesn't need to be a complicated thing, right? Um, so I suppose what's your advice when it comes to like how to at least set up at first, like what is the first stage of governance that you'd put in place when it comes to like contribution, just to ensure that like the chances of you getting high quality contributions through.
Yeah, I think it's, like, definitely have some sort of process in place, like, as a bare minimum, know that you're gonna have to put in a process. It's not something like, "Oh, we'll just figure it out later," because like, people will just come to us and as like, that because it gets messy quickly. I think it's, like, really helping set expectations, as to, what is a component and what isn't a component, and how does a component come into the design system. So, um it seems like you might have to come up with a lot, but I don't think it's too much. It's only because people are gonna be excited about your design system, and they're gonna be excited about the idea of having this help them in their day-to-day work, and they're excited to just contribute. So, but not all contributions are great. So, I think it's just, like, making sure you have people who will help decide, but also have some, like, foundational guidelines that will help them make a decision. So, like, um, for example, if you know someone's component is completely, like, wackadoodle, like, you're just like, "Okay, you know what? Like, you can go ahead and put it in your product, and we'll see how it does, because and if it does well for, like, 3 to 6 months, great, then maybe we can consider it. We can definitely consider it if other people, other products like that component and can see value in adding it, because then you're trying to scale that component, and then that's when you can consider putting it in. Um,
It's the fuck around and find out model, right? I think that's the
Yeah. Yeah, 'cause I think the thing is like, I think there's a balance because you want some, like, practicality because I think some people, when they design a component, it can be very personal to them.
Mm,
And then when you say no to their component, they take it personally of like, "You didn't like my design,"
yeah,
which maybe that is the truth, but you you wanna make sure there's some foundational grounding in that of like, well, you put it in your product, and in 3 to 6 months, we've gotten like 50 bug tickets or customer complaints or support calls or whatever, right? So, like, it's a flag, right? So then they're
or
not.
the conversion through that
Yeah.
particular, I don't know, flow has dipped since you've improved the improved
Improved, yeah.
the
Yeah, so
component.
I think that's the thing is, like, having some of those guardrails that the people help deciding on the components have something to rely on to be able to,
Yeah,
like, say, "This is our process," and people are usually okay with the process. They can be like, "Okay, I see what you're saying, like, we don't wanna add too many components too quickly, so we can test it out." Because you're not banning them from making or
yeah.
using their crazy, outlandish, bad UX component in their product. Good luck to them.
I think part of it as well when it comes to you were talking about like providing some guidelines beforehand. I do think that part of it is establishing some guidelines that aren't just when somebody's submitting a component, having almost like a checklist of things that they need to go through to make sure that it's um, up to the bare minimum standard for what you'd expect. So making sure that they're checking things like I don't know, what comes to mind is like accessibility, that you've actually used it, tested it, and you've got some feedback. Like whatever it is that's in place in your in your organization. I mean, that might be the purview of the design system team to do that as well. But just making sure that if it's not, then like that is there. And if you don't have that, if it's the product teams don't need to do, product designers don't need to do any of that stuff before they're submitting um something into the design system, then making sure at least they're documenting the reasons behind the decisions that have been made to a degree, so that it is also that you understand where they've come from this, so that if you're going to go back and give the feedback, you've got the full context. And I think that just having those a couple of simple questions that go with the contribution, so it isn't just that somebody's chucking in a chucking you a Figma file and going, "Here you go. Here's something to the design system. Have fun." Um, I think the other one is also I really like Nathan Curtis did a whole article. I think it was Nathan Curtis did a whole article about tiered contributions as well, around the different types of contributions. I think it's something that I mean, to be honest, go and find that article. I'll share it and put it in the show notes as well when we release this as a podcast. But um, uh, just steal that article and use that as your tiering system, maybe, or create your own. But I think that again, like understanding that people can make different levels of contribution as well. So that if somebody does have a half-baked idea for a component that they haven't really thought through particularly well, knowing that they can, instead of submitting that as a contribution, they could submit a one line with a couple of bullet points underneath it of, hey, I've noticed a gap that we need this component. We're using this current thing in our product, but we, ideally would like this being put in the backlog, and here are our requirements for it. And that can be a valid contribution to the design system. Like a request can be a valid contribution. It doesn't need to be like a fully fleshed out thing.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I think there's also so on Zero Height, I did write a couple checklists for vetting, components and patterns. We'll put that in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
It's pretty thorough, but I mean, if you're gonna put something into your design system, you really should think about it.
I
I think
mean, I'm pretty sure isn't that's your full name, isn't it? It's Michelle Farah Chin.
it
But
is, yeah.
um,
It's not soy
mm.
sauce. It's thorough. That's what yeah, yeah. Okay. Great.
So if somebody does give you a dog poop component, um, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that in a constructive way that doesn't then eat up your entire time? So you end up being, instead of a design systems team, an internal like design critique team.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's a really good question because I think you can get tied up into someone who's very adamant about that. So I
Yeah.
think, quickly like, yeah, I think you have to kind of be judicious with the time you spend. So, like, kind of falling back on those rules of like, yeah, go ahead, make that for your product, and we'll see you in 6 months, right? Like, that's a quick way. But if you wanted to, really ask them, like, really, if you genuinely wanted to like help improve, and you did have the time, like, I think asking them questions around like, what was the idea behind this? Like, what was the problem they're trying to solve? Could other components, existing components help? I think a long time ago, like I don't know, maybe this is like 6 or 7 years ago, like Cap Watkins, I think he was, I met him when he was like at Etsy, but he became like the director of design at BuzzFeed or something. He created this like flow chart of like when you should create a new component. And it's like basically everything points to like no, like you just shouldn't ever like you should just use what's there. Um so, like, really kind of thoroughly vetting it with them of like, "Hey, what about these other components? Like, what have you tried? What doesn't work with this situation?" Because that could also resolve the need for a new component as well.
Yeah.
And I think just really asking questions, to get more of their context rather than just starting to say like, "This component's ugly. No one would use it. No one knows how to use it. It's overcomplicated," right? Like, people aren't gonna respond well. So it comes down to like critique best practices?
Yeah.
I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I I haven't cracked this particular nut, I'll be honest with you. Um, because I do think that there is I think I'd probably pose more of a question back of well, not a question back, but a thought um process back of I think that one of the things that we need to think about when we're doing this is to when you're giving that kind of critique back or that feedback back um, is to make sure that you're not demoralizing somebody from contributing in the future, right? Like I think that that's like a really big thing because if you're too harsh, then you're going to end up with no contributions, and your design system team's going to be seen as this awful ivory tower who sits up on high and makes um makes decisions based on their secret tome of design systems that is locked behind a case. And like that's a great actually that is a really really great way if you want to be out of a job and get your design system deprioritized. Like that's really great because you're not going to have champions anywhere in the business. On the other side, as I said, you could just end up being that like internal professional services that ends up giving a lot of your things. So I think that there's a level that sits somewhere in the middle there, and I kind of like don't really know what that is. But I do think what you were saying is right. I think that like setting up um the expectations and having those like flowcharts and everything ahead of time can actually like help mitigate some of that and trying to avoid it. In terms of actually giving the feedback, yeah.
Yeah, because I think as long as the resources are available, people will find them and use them. It's
Yeah.
just when they're not available, they'll come to you for everything, right?
Yeah.
Like it's even like when people are like, "Hey, how do I use this button?" And if it's not documented, they're just going
Yeah.
to keep coming to you when you could easily just point them to the URL and say like, "All the information you need is right here."
Yeah.
And people are super amicable to like following processes and stuff. Like they understand that design systems need some sort of governance. So if it's there, then they'll follow it. Um,
I just realized I'm going to go back on what I just said and completely disagree with myself. I do. There is one practice that I do think works, or I have seen work in the past. The big caveat that I will say, and it's not anything revolutionary either. The big caveat that I will say with this, though, is that you need to have a culture of strong like critique in your organization.
yeah.
You need to have it so that folks can actually um, openly critique things and people don't get offended, which is, I think, a skill in itself to build that practice within an organization. Because, yeah, it can be that that isn't how it is. But I do think that having an open critique system is actually pretty good for a design system as well. I think that having like what you would normally have within your design system, with your in your wider design teams with critiques, depending how big your org is. Um, I think having that for the design systems team where it's like an open session where you know, pull in contributions or pull in new things that the design system team are working on and do open critiques, is actually a really good practice to get into. Um, because I think that it opens that critique up to a wider audience as well, so that folks can hear what's being said, and also so you can get that diverse like view of opinions. Because I think that uh, yeah, it is very important. How to do that on a global scale is another good one, which we'll maybe get to in a couple of minutes, because there's a good question that just came through. Also, I think that just to make a point there as well, because it's not just on the design side. I think on the dev side as well. I think that it's one. I think I can't remember where I put this in. I put this in an article somewhere, I'm sure. Is good practice, if your engineering org is set up in this way that you do peer reviewing, is to make sure that when you're doing peer reviews on the design systems code, that it's not just being done by the design systems engineers, that you're involving other people from around the org. And then also, if the design systems folks are also doing peer reviewing on the code on the product side as well. Again, it depends on the scale of your org. I'm very privileged in that I've only really worked in scale ups, and never in huge orgs in this capacity. So I can only really comment on that size of org. But I do think it's a good practice to get into.
Yeah.
Slightly off topic, but
No, totally. It's fine. Yeah. I think the other thing for Kelly's question, for suggestions on how to build a strong open critique system for a design team. One book that I really like and I've used as a backbone for developing like a critique culture, is the Discussing Design book by Adam Connor and Aaron Azari. So that one that one's like really helpful. And that like we worked on it at, like we created the culture as a team. So it
yeah,
wasn't like this is what manager said and you must do it. It was like, hey, like what's going on with our critique culture currently and how can we improve it and like what does it mean to us? And so we came up with this whole like way of how our critique culture was, which was really helpful.
yeah,
And then I think you can scale it depending on how, like there's lots of different ways to offer a critique. Like it could be on a Zoom call, it could be asynchronously, like putting comments in Figma and just kind of deciding like what the mechanisms are. And
mm.
that can help for global teams as well for different time zones.
Yeah. I know that I know that when the bigger teams that I've worked in have ended up doing it at like a um they've basically just scaled it at like product org level or squad level, depending on how big the teams were. That basically you can't. It gets to a point where it is very hard to do like a cross company critique. I think the big thing with like establishing a strong critique culture is around establishing what your critique charter is, like what
Yeah.
your charter is when it comes to critiques, and making sure that everybody's on the same page. Like I mean, it would be nice if we could just say, "Hey, don't be a dick," but it is a little bit more complex than that, and I think that it is like just define your rules of what critique means to you and your organization, and I think you can do it. Yeah, a Google search to like see what other folks have done there as well. I think we have an article as well on zeroheight around design critiques as well that I can share um, in the show notes. Um, Cool. Also, another book recommendation, Org Design for Design Orgs has a good little section on critiques as well and like running critique culture by Peter Merholtz and Kristen Skinner. Definitely recommend it. Um, on to more questions because there are some good ones coming through here. So we have one here, another one from Kelly actually. Any suggestions for how to handle a contribution model when there is no sole dedicated design system team or person? Do you have any recommendations there, Michelle?
I feel like that's a little scary. It's like, yeah, you're just like in this amorphous blob without
Don't.
like a direction. Like,
Yeah.
um, and I don't know if you have someone managing the design system ish or something, if there's like a point person, if there's anyone calling any sort of shots, like I think, that's a good start. But I think for me, I don't have like a traditional art design background. So like my visual design isn't as strong as other people's and I was in charge of managing the design system. And I like relied on other designers to provide the visual direction, but we were working in a federated design system, and it's still hard because we didn't have a a specific art director leading that vision. Um, and I couldn't do it. Like, I mean, I could, but it wouldn't be great. So I think the other thing is like we relied on like the directors of the product to kind of orchestrate the creative direction and ensuring that things were like holistically aligning. And part of that I think is because the directors had a better sense of visual design than I did. So if there is like I think like if you have like directors of design that can provide that vision and guidance, I think that is an alternative to when you have a lot of people who are kind of like informally involved with the design system, just to make sure there's a cohesive sense. But I think if you can, as a first step, relying on the visual design prowess of the team because they are designers. They should have some level of skill set, or some people should have some level of skill set to contribute toward that vision. But when it's multiple people, it can get a little off track or not focused enough. I don't know.
Um, in terms of from a process point of view, the contribution model, when it's like a federated team, I think that it's going to be hard. And I think that one of the things that I definitely put out there is that part of the job is actually showing the pain of not having dedicated resource to deal with your design system, to a point where it gets so painful that they will dedicate resource to it. And a large part of that is like set up whatever processes you need, and usually that is like whatever like the formal way of tracking those things are. So whether that's like a Jira board or Trello or whatever it is that like you track contributions, and set up what the expected, like, I don't know, to use crappy terms, SLA is on like how quick you want to get through them, especially if there's no like dedicated resource to getting through the design system contributions. And then make that very visible and very transparent as much as you can. Because, if people can see that things aren't moving on there, then they're going to start asking questions as to why things aren't moving on there. And then that is a really good opportunity for somebody to stand up and say, well, it's because nobody's managing this. So
Yeah.
if you want it to move, maybe give us some resource. I think making things visible and making that pain visible is like a really good.
Yeah. I think it's a very good point because other stakeholders and leadership will be like, "Well, you have a design system. I don't see what the problem is." Um, and that's because they might have a different expectation of what goes
Yeah.
on in a design system. It's not just the tangible outputs of the components,
Yeah.
but there's a whole lot of process and governance. And we do have a couple articles for running Scrappy and how that's a
Yeah.
temporary format. And then not to shamelessly plug, but to shamelessly plug how we document. The survey is coming out in a couple weeks, and going through the data, we realized like there's a critical point when teams get funded for design systems or companies invest and prioritize them. Um, and then I think you can use that as a benchmark of like, look, we're at this point where a lot of other companies have started to invest in their design system. If we were to stay competitive, this is what we need to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we have time for maybe one last question, just because I really like um, this question, and it's another one from Kelly. So thanks, Kelly, for all the questions. But how do you strike the balance between a design system component versus an individual product or feature component while not creating product silos that stray too far from the design system? Basically, how much flexibility should you build into your design system? Um, I've definitely got views on this.
Yeah, you want to go for it?
Yeah, sure. I think that there's actually a really great talk around this, that I think I've recommended on the podcast before, but it's from Converge US last year from Jerry Reed. I'm pretty sure, I can't remember the URL, but if you go to the Zero Height website and go into the resources section, you'll see the Converge videos. Um, but it's about how to deal with your design system as it grows up as a teenager and leaves home, I think is the gist of the talk.
Yeah, gets to that
Um,
apartment.
but they so Jerry goes into a lot of detail about the challenges that they faced at News UK, which I think is just a perfect illustration of the need for flexibility within your design system, because it is around like how rigid you are with your design system. And the big learning that they had, and it's what I've heard from a lot of other places as well, is actually try and be as flexible as you can with your design system, especially if you're dealing with multiple brands, multiple products. Um, there is a, to me anyway, I feel like there's a threshold of like what is acceptable use of a design system. And it's the same as like test coverage in dev world. 100% test coverage is a really great pipe dream that you can have, but is not, usually ends up actually constraining people in a way that becomes harmful and unproductive and less efficient. Um, your job is to figure out what that threshold is of like what like adherence to the design system is, that is acceptable as like something that is actually going to bring, you know, those efficiencies and those gains and that joy to to people's lives. um that is something to and I think it is for every place to figure out, but that is something that like you should be aiming for, like explicitly, this is our level of flexibility, and this is what is acceptable use of the design system, and this is what's, you know, acceptable for you all to go out and create your own Frankenstein components, that are like single use. um is that,
Uh, yeah,
do you agree?
yeah, yeah. I think, especially with like larger companies and like
Mm,
legacy products and stuff like that, like, you're gonna have to have that level of flexibility. But I think what also is helpful is if you have, like, advocates for your design system kind of within these teams who can, during critique, say like, "Hey, instead of creating this new component, maybe we could rely on this existing component." And just kind of, like, getting people into the habit of thinking about the other components that way. So that's a good
yeah,
way to kind of, like, maintain a level of consistency and some flexibility too. And, even with the tool setup, like with the styles that you can have or the variables, that's also helpful because nobody wants to build that from scratch. So even if they're creating a new component, if they can leverage some of those foundations,
yeah.
that will keep some level of consistency, until, it's time to like up level that component or what have you. But
I've
it's a
got
process. Like,
I was going
yeah.
to say, I've got a new topic that we need to discuss, which is around how the base level and the pattern level, like the very top level and the very bottom level, are the most important things, and everything else can just get in the bin. That I'm stealing
Oh.
from Amy Cube. So we can talk about that in a future episode. Uh, Anyway, I think that's all the time we have for today because it's already past 5 p.m. For us here in the UK. So that's it for today. But if you have any questions, and there are some great questions that are still in the chat, so please come over to the Zero Height Slack community zeros and continue the conversation in there. You can find that at zeroheight.com/Slack. You can also tweet us if that's still a thing. Xus does not sound like a thing.
No.
But you can tweet us at zeroheight, or you can get in touch with us, the hosts, at Lurk Movie and at Soy Sauce Chin on Twitter. But until then, see you next time.